April 18, 1942. The morning sun breaks over the Nakajima Aircraft Company factory in Oda, outside Tokyo. Steam rises from the forging hammers. The smell of hot metal and machine oil fills the air. Master craftsman Tanaka Yoshiro lays his calloused hands on the fuselage of a Mitsubishi A6M0 fighter, the 53rd aircraft he has helped complete this month. Each rivet has been inspected twice. Each aluminum panel has been shaped by hand, then checked against templates drawn by engineers who spent years perfecting every curve, every angle. The Zero is a masterpiece of precision engineering, a blade forged with the discipline of samurai tradition translated into aeronautical form. Tanaka does not know that across the Pacific Ocean, in a sprawling complex of factories that never go dark, American workers are building fighters at a rate his mind cannot comprehend. He does not know that while he perfects one aircraft, Detroit is birthing 20. He believes, as his supervisors have told him, that Japanese quality will overcome American quantity. He believes in the purity of craftsmanship over the chaos of mass production. He does not yet understand that he is watching the old world make its last stand against the new. The story of the Second World War's industrial dimension cannot be told without understanding what happened in the years before Pearl Harbor, in the decades before a single bomb fell on Honolulu. Japan's path to war was paved not with ambitions of conquest alone, but with the bitter arithmetic of resource scarcity. An island nation with virtually no domestic oil, limited iron ore, and a population bursting beyond its agricultural capacity, Japan looked outward for survival. The military leadership that gradually seized control of the government in the 1930s saw empire not as luxury, but as necessity. Manchuria would provide coal and steel. Southeast Asia would provide rubber and oil. The ideology of the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere dressed naked resource acquisition in the language of liberation, but beneath the propaganda lay a simple truth. Japan needed materials it did not possess, and it would take them by force if necessary. The Japanese aviation industry that emerged in this context was a reflection of the nation itself, brilliant, disciplined, and desperately efficient. Engineers trained in universities modeled after German technical schools absorbed the latest aeronautical theories from Europe and America. Companies like Mitsubishi, Nakajima, and Kawasaki competed for military contracts with designs that pushed the boundaries of what lightweight fighters could achieve. When Mitsubishi's chief designer Horikoshi Jiro began work on what would become the Zero in 1937, he faced constraints that would have paralyzed Western designers. The Imperial Japanese Navy demanded a fighter that could escort bombers on missions extending over 800 miles, outmaneuver any potential enemy, and operate from aircraft carriers with limited deck space. It needed to achieve all this while powered by engines that produced substantially less horsepower than American or British equivalents, because Japan lacked the metallurgical capacity to forge the high-performance alloys that enabled more powerful motors. Horikoshi's solution was elegant and terrible in equal measure. He stripped away everything that did not contribute directly to performance. The Zero carried no armor plating to protect the pilot. Its fuel tanks were not self-sealing. A bullet puncher would not trigger automatic closure mechanisms. The airframe was constructed of an aluminum alloy that was lighter than standard materials but more brittle, more prone to catastrophic failure when struck by heavy-caliber rounds. What emerged was an aircraft that could outturn, outclimb, and outrange anything the Allies possessed in the Pacific theater in 1941. It was also a flying coffin, a machine that sacrificed pilot survival for tactical performance. This trade-off was not accidental. It was the calculated decision of a nation that possessed brilliant engineers, but lacked the aluminum, the oil, and the industrial capacity to build both performance and protection into the same airframe. The Zero made its combat debut over China in 1940, where it achieved such lopsided kill ratios that intelligence reports reaching Washington were dismissed as exaggeration. American military observers could not believe that Japan, a nation they viewed as technologically inferior, capable of producing only cheap imitations of Western goods, had designed a fighter superior to anything in the U.S. arsenal. This was the racism of underestimation, the dangerous assumption that industrial sophistication followed the color line. The price of this arrogance would be paid in blood over the Philippines, over Wake Island, over the burning waters of Pearl Harbor. When Zero pilots escorted bomber formations south in December 1941, they flew with supreme confidence. They had the finest fighter in the world beneath them. Their training was extensive, their discipline absolute. They expected to sweep American and British aircraft from Asian skies, just as they had swept the Chinese. What they did not expect, what their commanders did not tell them because their commanders did not fully understand it themselves, was that they were not fighting a nation. They were fighting a continental industrial organism that would treat war as a production problem to be solved with the same methods that had revolutionized automobile manufacturing. Detroit in 1942 does not sleep. The Ford Willow Run plant, a single building nearly a mile long, operates on 3 shifts that bleed into one continuous flow of labor and machinery. The factory floor is lit by overhead lamps that create perpetual daylight. The sound is overwhelming, the pneumatic scream of rivet guns, the bang of drop hammers, the whine of turbines being test-fired in enclosed cells. Workers arrive on buses and streetcars from neighborhoods across Michigan. They are farmers' sons from downstate, black families newly arrived from Alabama and Mississippi, women whose husbands are fighting in North Africa or training in England. Many have never worked in a factory before December 7, 1941. They are taught by foremen who learned their trade building Model Ts, who understand that complexity must be broken into simple, repeatable steps. Henry Ford himself, old and increasingly erratic, still visits the plant to watch B-24 Liberator bombers roll down the assembly line he designed. Each aircraft is broken into sub-assemblies, fuselages built in one section, wings in another, engines and turrets and bombardier stations in dedicated cells. The components converge like tributaries flowing into a river. A bomber that would take thousands of man-hours to build using traditional methods emerges from Willow Run every 63 minutes at peak production. Ford's engineers have applied automobile logic to aerospace manufacturing, and the result is a miracle of organized chaos. This is not an accident of geography or luck. This is the culmination of 40 years of American industrial evolution, of mass production techniques pioneered in Chicago stockyards and perfected in Highland Park auto plants. The United States entered the 20th century as an industrial power. It entered the Second World War as an industrial superpower without peer. The capacity that built 15 million automobiles in the 1920s, that strung electrical wire to nearly every farm by 1940, that constructed dams and bridges and railway networks spanning a continent, this capacity now turned to war with the full backing of a government that understood, perhaps for the first time in American history, that survival depended on outproducing the enemy. President Roosevelt's call for 50,000 aircraft in 1940 was met with skepticism by military planners who thought the number fantastical. By 1944, American factories were producing 96,000 aircraft annually. The numbers transcend comprehension. They represent not individual machines, but an industrial tsunami, a flood of steel and aluminum and high-octane gasoline that no nation organized around artisanal precision could hope to match. Japanese engineers understood this, even if their military commanders did not. Reports reached Tokyo throughout 1942 and 1943 detailing American production figures. Intelligence analysts verified the numbers. Ford alone was building more heavy bombers in 1 month than Nakajima and Mitsubishi built of all aircraft types combined in the same period. The response from Imperial General Staff was to emphasize quality over quantity, to insist that superior training and fighting spirit would overcome material disadvantage. This was not entirely false. Zero pilots in 1942 were among the most skilled aviators in the world, many with combat experience over China. Japanese torpedo bombers executing the attack on Pearl Harbor demonstrated coordination and precision that American observers grudgingly admitted was first-rate. But skill and spirit cannot overcome mathematics indefinitely. For every Zero lost in combat, Japanese factories required months to build a replacement and years to train a pilot to the necessary standard. For every American fighter lost, Detroit built 5 more and training schools in Texas and California graduated pilots who might lack the finesse of their Japanese counterparts, but who flew aircraft with armor plating, self-sealing fuel tanks, and most crucially, radios that allowed coordinated tactics. The symbolic object that haunts this story is not a weapon, but a tool, the rivet gun. In Japanese factories, riveting was semi-skilled labor performed by workers who had undergone extensive training. Each rivet was placed with care, inspected by a supervisor, and verified against engineering specifications. Quality control was embedded in every step. An aircraft that left a Japanese factory was built to exacting standards. In American factories, riveting was performed by workers who learned the skill in a week. Rosie the Riveter was not a metaphor. She was a statistical reality, one of hundreds of thousands of women who entered industrial labor for the first time. The rivet guns they wielded were pneumatic, faster and more powerful than manual tools. The pace was relentless. Efficiency experts with stopwatches observed every motion, identifying bottlenecks, redesigning workflows to shave seconds from each operation. This was Taylorism applied to war production, the assumption that labor was a variable to be optimized, that human beings could be integrated into mechanical systems as interchangeable components. It was dehumanizing. It was also devastatingly effective. The Japanese approach honored the worker as craftsman. The American approach treated the worker as a production unit. The former produced beautiful aircraft. The latter produced victory. This is an uncomfortable truth, one that reveals the dark underside of American industrial success. The factories that built the weapons that defeated fascism were themselves organized along principles that reduced human beings to instruments of output. Workers at Willow Run reported injury rates that would be considered criminal by modern standards. The speed of a line caused accidents, fingers crushed in presses, arms caught in conveyor machinery, hearing loss from constant noise exposure. Black workers were often assigned the hottest, dirtiest jobs despite equal qualifications. Women were paid less than men for identical work. Labor unions fought for basic protections and were often met with hostility from management that viewed any slowdown as sabotage. The aircraft that rolled off American assembly lines were built not just with steel and aluminum, but with sweat, pain, and exploitation. To romanticize this production is to ignore the human cost. To deny its effectiveness is to ignore history. By mid-1943, the disparity in production had become existential. Japanese factories were building approximately 1,000 Zero fighters per year at peak output. American factories were building over 4,000 P-51 Mustangs alone, not counting Corsairs, Hellcats, Thunderbolts, and other types. The numbers extended beyond aircraft. American shipyards were launching aircraft carriers faster than Japan could sink them. Liberty ships carrying fuel, ammunition, and supplies rolled down slipways in weeks rather than months. The Kaiser shipyards in California employed techniques so radical that traditional naval architects dismissed them as shortcuts, prefabricated sections welded together rather than riveted, standardized components that allowed for rapid assembly. Some of these ships broke apart in rough seas, victims of hasty construction. But most reached their destinations, and the volume was such that losses to U-boats and air attack became acceptable. This was arithmetic as strategy. Build so many that the enemy cannot destroy them faster than they are replaced. Japanese planners recognized the trap they had entered. The southern resource area, the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies, the rubber plantations of Malaya, the rice paddies of Indochina, had been seized at great cost. But holding these territories required a navy and air force that needed steel and aluminum, and fuel that now had to be transported across ocean routes under constant submarine attack. The Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere was supposed to create a self-sufficient empire. Instead, it created a logistics nightmare. Tankers carrying crude oil from Borneo to refineries in Japan ran a gauntlet of American submarines that grew more numerous and more effective with each passing month. By 1944, the flow of resources had slowed to a trickle. Factories in Oda and Nagoya that should have been building fighters were forced to reduce production because aluminum stocks were depleted. The great machines that master craftsman Tanaka operated with such pride sat idle because the raw materials had not arrived. The Zero that had dominated Pacific skies in 1942 was now facing Hellcats and Corsairs that were faster, better armed, and flown by pilots supported by radar, radio networks, and an industrial base that could afford to build training aircraft by the thousands. The emotional contrast that Japanese aviators experienced was not merely tactical, but existential. A Zero pilot shot down over Rabaul in 1943, rescued from the ocean by a passing destroyer, reported to his squadron commander that he had engaged 8 American fighters simultaneously. His aircraft had been hit repeatedly, but remained airborne until fuel exhaustion forced him to ditch. He expressed shock not at the skill of his opponents, which he rated as adequate but not exceptional, but at their numbers. Where did so many aircraft come from? How was it possible that every day brought more of them? These were questions that intelligence briefings could not satisfactorily answer because the answers revealed a truth that undermined the ideological foundations of Japanese militarism. The idea that spirit could overcome material advantage was central to Bushido as adapted for modern warfare. Pilots were taught that courage, discipline, and willingness to sacrifice would prevail over enemies who were soft, individualistic, and obsessed with material comfort. The reality they encountered over the Pacific was an enemy that possessed both material abundance and increasingly competent warriors who fought with discipline and coordination. The American pilots climbing into Hellcats at Guadalcanal were not soft. Many were farm boys from Iowa and Texas who had learned to handle machinery from childhood, who treated aircraft as tools to be mastered rather than sacred instruments of martial spirit. The transformation in American fighter tactics between 1942 and 1944 reflected this pragmatic approach. Early encounters with the Zero taught painful lessons. American fighters that attempted to dogfight, to engage in turning battles where agility mattered most, were shredded. The solution was not to build more agile aircraft, but to change tactics to exploit American advantages. The F-6F Hellcat was heavier than the Zero, less maneuverable in turn, but faster in a dive and far more durable. American doctrine evolved to emphasize altitude advantage and hit-and-run attacks. Hellcat pilots were trained to dive on Zeros, fire a burst from 6 heavy machine guns, and extend away using superior speed. If the Zero pursued, the American pilot dove toward the ocean where his aircraft's power and structural strength gave him an edge. If the Zero attempted to climb back to altitude, it became an easy target for the next diving attack. This was warfare as engineering problem. Identify the enemy's strengths, avoid engaging on his terms, force combat conditions that favor your design advantages. It was not glamorous. It was murderously effective. By 1944, Japanese factories had transitioned to building kamikaze aircraft, glorified flying bombs stripped of everything except engine, fuel, and explosives. This was the logical endpoint of a philosophy that prioritized spirit over material. If Japan could not match American production, it would match American sacrifice by institutionalizing suicide as a tactical weapon. The kamikaze program was presented to the Japanese public as evidence of ultimate devotion, proof that Japanese warriors would give everything for the emperor and nation. The reality was that it represented the complete collapse of Japan's aerial warfare capability. Kamikaze aircraft were cheaper and faster to build than Zeros because they did not need to return. Pilots require minimal training because they only needed to fly once. The tactic inflicted significant casualties on American naval forces off Okinawa, but it could not alter strategic outcomes. The ships kept coming. The carriers kept launching fighters. For every kamikaze that struck home, 10 were shot down by radar-directed anti-aircraft fire or swarmed by Hellcats that now operated with near impunity over Japanese-held territory. Master craftsman Tanaka, if he survived the war, would have witnessed the final degradation of everything he had worked to build. The precision factory where he shaped aluminum with such care was likely destroyed by B-29 bombing raids that leveled Japan's industrial centers in 1945. The superfortresses that flew over Tokyo and Osaka were themselves products of American industrial excess. Each aircraft cost more than an entire year's production of Japanese factories, yet the United States built thousands of them. The fire raids that incinerated Japanese cities were enabled by logistics trains that stretched across the Pacific, by fuel supplies that never ran short, by maintenance crews that kept engines running through sheer abundance of spare parts. Japan's cities burned not because American bombers were superior in design to Japanese interceptors. The late war Ki-84 Frank was by most measures a match for American fighters, but because Japan could not build enough of them, could not fuel them consistently, could not train pilots to replace losses, could not operate radar networks to provide early warning, could not do any of these things because the industrial base that enabled modern warfare had been systematically destroyed by an enemy. That fought with the logic of the assembly line. The rivet gun symbolism extends beyond factory floors. It represents the democratization of war production, the transformation of total war into a project that required not just soldiers but entire populations. American propaganda posters urged citizens to buy war bonds, to conserve resources, to work extra shifts. But unlike the Axis powers, where total war meant starvation rations and forced labor, American civilians experienced wartime prosperity. Factory workers earned wages higher than they had seen during the Depression. Overtime pay allowed families to buy homes, to save for the future. Rationing was real but not severe. Gasoline and butter were scarce, but no one starved. This abundance was strategic, not incidental. A well-fed, reasonably compensated workforce was more productive than a desperate one. The United States fought the Second World War while raising living standards for millions of its citizens. This was the ultimate expression of American industrial capacity, the ability to produce both guns and butter, to fight a global war while simultaneously improving domestic conditions. It was obscene in its excess. It was also the foundation of victory. Japanese soldiers who became prisoners of war and were transported to camps in the United States reported profound psychological shock. They expected harsh treatment, starvation, torture. Instead, they found camps where food was adequate, medical care available, and in some cases opportunities for work and education provided. The cognitive dissonance was severe. They had been taught that Americans were decadent, weak, obsessed with material comfort to the point of spiritual corruption. What they discovered was a nation so wealthy that it could afford to treat even its enemies with a baseline of care that exceeded what Japan provided its own soldiers. POWs working on farms in Nebraska or factories in Texas saw abundance that seemed incomprehensible, supermarkets stocked with food, roads filled with automobiles, civilians who showed no signs of wartime deprivation. Some dismissed it as propaganda, elaborate theater designed to break their spirit. Others began to question the narratives they had been fed. If America was weak and decadent, why was it winning? If Japan's spiritual strength was superior, why were its cities burning while American cities thrived? These were dangerous questions in an ideological framework that depended on absolutes. The epilogue to this story is written in steel and memory. The factories that built Zeros are gone, destroyed by bombs or torn down after the war. Willow Run continued producing aircraft into the jet age, then automobiles, and finally closed in 2010, a victim of the same industrial transformation that had made it possible. The rivet guns fell silent. But what they built, not just aircraft and ships, but the model of industrial warfare itself, persisted. The United States emerged from a Second World War as the dominant global power, not because its soldiers were braver or its generals wiser, but because it had demonstrated the capacity to mobilize resources on a scale that redefined what was possible. The Soviet Union learned these lessons and applied them to its own industrial base, creating the Cold War's central tension. Two superpowers capable of producing weapons in volumes that made conventional warfare unthinkable. Japan's post-war trajectory is its own complex story. The nation that lost the war of factories became an industrial power again within a generation, this time building automobiles and electronics rather than fighter planes. Toyota's production system, which revolutionized manufacturing in the late 20th century, was in many ways a refinement of the principles that had governed Zero production: quality control, continuous improvement, respect for worker expertise. But it was applied without the resource constraints and ideological rigidity that had doomed Japan's wartime economy. The irony is profound. Japanese manufacturing excellence, freed from militarism and given access to global resources, achieved a kind of victory that the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere never could. The engineers who survived the war built an economic miracle on the ashes of the empire they had armed. The recurring image that closes this narrative is not a factory or a battlefield, but a museum hangar where a restored Zero sits beside a restored Hellcat. Both aircraft are beautiful in their way. The Zero's lines are elegant, almost delicate. The Hellcat is blunt, powerful, a machine designed by engineers who prioritized function over aesthetics. Visitors walk between them, red plaques explaining specifications and combat records. The numbers tell the story the airframes cannot. Zero fighters built during the war, approximately 10,000. American fighters built during the war, over 100,000. This disparity was not a failure of Japanese engineering or courage. It was the arithmetic of industrial modernity, the cold calculus, that determined victory in a conflict where resources mattered more than valor. Tanaka Yoshiro, if he is remembered at all, exists in archives as a name on production reports, one craftsman among thousands who built weapons with skill and dedication for a cause they did not choose. His American counterparts are similarly anonymous, their names lost to history, except in the memories of families who remember a grandfather who built bombers, a great-aunt who worked the graveyard shift riveting fuselages. They were not heroes in the traditional sense. They did not charge machine gun nests or fly into anti-aircraft fire. They stood at stations on assembly lines and performed repetitive tasks that ached bones and numbed minds. Their contribution was collective, measured in tonnage and production quotas, rather than individual acts of courage. Yet wars are won by such people, by the millions who perform the unglamorous work that enables others to fight. The factories were as much battlefields as the islands and oceans, and the victory forged there was as decisive as any won at sea or in the air. The truth this history reveals is uncomfortable for those who prefer clean narratives of good and evil. American victory was built on industrial capacity that exploited labor, segregated workers by race, and accepted casualties in the pursuit of efficiency. It was also built on genuine productivity gains, technological innovation, and organizational genius that transformed warfare. Both things are true simultaneously. The United States did not defeat Japan through moral superiority, but through superior organization and resource access. The ideological dimension, democracy versus militarism, freedom versus oppression, was real and important, but it was not decisive on the battlefield. What was decisive was aluminum tonnage, petroleum refining capacity, and the ability to translate raw materials into finished weapons faster than the enemy could destroy them. In the end, the 10,000 Zeros and the 100,000 American war machines represent two visions of modernity colliding. One vision emphasized mastery through discipline, quality through careful craftsmanship, victory through superior spirit. The other embraced abundance, accepted imperfection in individual units in exchange for overwhelming numbers, and treated war as a production challenge to be optimized. History rendered its verdict not through moral judgment, but through outcomes. The assembly line defeated the artisan's workshop. The society that could mobilize total industrial capacity crushed the society that relied on skill and sacrifice. This was not inevitable. Earlier in history, disciplined smaller forces had overcome larger ones. But by the 20th century, industrial warfare had created conditions where quantity possessed a quality all its own. The forges have gone cold. The factories are silent or repurposed. But the lesson remains, carved into history with the indelible mark of 100,000 machines that flew, fought, and returned home because they were armored, because they were replaceable, because they were built by a system that valued output over elegance. Freedom, it turned out, was not just an ideal to be defended. It was also a production quota to be met, a three-shift operation that never slept, a river of steel that flowed from heartland factories to distant battlefields. The abundance was vulgar. The abundance was wasteful. The abundance was freedom's gift to itself, the capacity to outbuild, outlast, and overwhelm any force that relied on scarcity disguised as virtue. That was the real story of the Zero and the Detroit machines. One represented the old world's last refinement. The other heralded the new world's raw, unstoppable power.